Okay, so this title of this session is how to show learning gain through technology, and it goes through 4 sections. First of all, starting off with why measure learning impact, then thinking about measuring learning impact of technology, also measuring the impact of technology on learning, how to integrate measurement of learning gain into what we do, and how to use our measures for students and staff. So let's start off just with this idea of measuring learning impact. And for those of you who maybe don't know what learning impact is and haven't come across the concept before, learning impact is actually about showing how we've improved somebody's skills. Now, within the context of schools in the UK, you would be really familiar with this idea of measuring learning impact because you would measure your pupils on a number of skills individually as they were going through an academic year. Within higher education, we don't in the UK have a tradition of measuring learning impact in that way with before and after measures. It's something that's coming our way, and I think we're aware that many people are aware in the UK that this is something that is going to that we are going to have to engage with. Our approach to measuring learning has really been substantively about endpoint assessment. So assessment at the end of a module, at the end of a course, and assessing whether somebody has met a particular set of standards rather than measuring learning impact and learning gain. Okay, so here's a definition of learning gain. You can see it's quite recent. This came out from our UK Office for Students, and it's just basically saying it's about the distance traveled or improvement in knowledge, skills, work readiness, and personal development that we can show between 2 points of time. So when we're measuring learning gain, it's incumbent on us to measure somebody's skills at least more than 1 point. So we have to be at 2 points or more in terms of measuring their abilities. And this can be very useful in some respects. We do it on a number of our programs here at the University of Gloucestershire, but we certainly don't do it on all. And so from that experience, we'll tell you about how we use it and how technology becomes involved. So why do we want to measure learning gain? First of all, let's start with students. It helps us guide student learning. It helps students identify their strengths and weaknesses, and it allows people on the back of that to determine what their plan for learning should be. And so it personalizes learning very much for them. We want to focus both on strengths and weaknesses because people often don't realize what their strengths are until we start measuring them, and maybe aren't taking the best advantage of their strengths. Often we think about the student who thinks that they're not very good at presenting things and maybe they're a bit shy, but actually when it comes down to it, they're really good presenters, and other people don't notice any nervousness that they have. How can they use that maybe strength that they're a little bit blind to better effect? But also we want to focus on people's weaknesses so that they can improve upon them and turn those around. So it enables them to put a plan in place and focus on particular things that they want to get out of a module or a course. So it enables them to develop personal objectives. Also, at the end, it allows them to see where they've actually moved on and where they haven't, so that they can continue their learning journey once they've left us. It also helps with the development of teaching. It allows tutors to see where they better develop and make a better difference for students. And on the back of that, they can adapt their content. It's a basis on which you can reflect as a tutor to determine what you will do later. Okay, and it can also help us assess the impact of new approaches that we try out, and that's particularly important to us in as we're delivering these workshops to people, because we're asking them to try out new ways of using technology. So we need them to understand how they are going to understand how the things that they do have worked or not worked. Third of all, there's this issue of quality assurance. All of our institutions have to, in some way, prove to others that we are adding value through the teaching and learning that we give. So first of all, it's about making sure that we as tutors know what difference we make, but also more as an institution, we can see demonstrate that value to our institutions, but also externally as well. External agencies will be interested in how we know whether we make a difference or not. And in different countries that we have, we will be inspected in different ways. In the UK, we're very self-regulated within our universities, but for some of our programs, for example, we have Ofsted, which is the schools inspector, coming in and having a look at us, and they will ask us that very question: how are you adding value and how can you demonstrate it? And through these sorts of measures, we can do that. So let's move on to measures of technology. First of all, I think we want to just maybe differentiate, and some of you will have come across this differentiation before when talking about measures, but different measures, that the types of measures that we have, some of them are about process measures and some of them are about outcome measures. What I've been talking about in learning gain so far is really an outcome measure. It's about the impact of our process overall on the student, for example. So through using technology, do students think that our learning resources are better quality? Through using technology, do our students progress further in developing their skills than they did before we used technology? And that's really sort of questions around the outcomes measures. But there's also these process measures where we will be focusing on the efficiency of the process that we follow. And we're talking about learning management systems, for example. They have enabled us to become more efficient and effective through lack of use of paper, for example, more environmentally friendly through that. So we may put in place measures of our processes as well, and about how effective they are. For example, if you're teaching in the module, we may have one of the process measures might actually be about attendance, for example, and engagement. To what extent are people turning up to the sessions? And can technology help us understand that? We don't keep registers at the University of Gloucestershire in a way that is paper and pencil. We get people to fill them in for themselves, and we can start to see whether people are attending or not, or people will walk into a room and their cards will indicate that they're in the room. So we can have those sorts of measures, and people who engage with our learning management system or our library more often, what difference is that making? People who engage with our videos, are they more likely to succeed? We can see through that engagement with the process of learning, we can start to see what impact we're having. At that point, I'd suggest that you break for a bit of an exercise and get people to think about what the process and outcome measures might be. And I think I've done this with people previously, and it's really interesting, the range of different measures that you might get, especially with different areas of study around a university. Certainly what I think an outcome measure might be is very different than our arts students. Sorry, our arts lecturers would think very different than nursing. And the importance of those outcomes will differ as well. if somebody put it to me once that if you have a nurse who is going to inject you, you don't really want somebody who got 40% on their injections assessment. You want somebody who got 90. And so the way that we deal with our different outcomes measures and process measures might be different. But we would want to be thinking what the differences that technology would make to the process of learning, but also the outcomes of learning. And we would want to just ask for that. And I think that can be a really good 20 to 25-minute discussion on the basis of that. Here's a couple of examples, and I would probably skip these slides if I had a nice whiteboard full of ideas from people. You can add ideas as well, but process might be student engagement as learning. I've already talked about the number of interactions with technology, those sorts of things. The number of ideas generated by students are maybe part of the process, and the outcomes might be student reactions, student learning, student behaviors, the impact. Do people get jobs? Those sorts of things through the technology that they've used. Okay. Moving on. We then we go on to the next section of thinking about how to integrate measurement of learning gain into our teaching and learning. The first thing to do that is if we're trying to find the impact of technology, we need to get people to use it, and we need to set tasks through the learning process, but also through the assessment that ask students to use technology, and that technology is almost essential to students achieving their task. You may also use technology to get them to reflect on a broad range of tools, of skills that they might need to develop. After the learning events, you might be using diagnosis tools like we've got for the TTT, for the Teaching Through Technology diagnosis tool, and you might get them to do that at the beginning and the end to get and understand what the impact is. You might get them to write case studies about their experience of using the technology. You might use in assessment, you might use peer evaluation to help them get an understanding of where they've made a difference, and we can use that as evidence as well. So what we're saying here is you need to find ways of including technology and using technology which is very much integrated with the assessment, and make it part of the process and the experience that students are going through. Okay. And that last point that's quite important. Make sure that at least some of it is graded so that it becomes important to the students, and that in the UK, students can be, especially undergraduate, very instrumental in what they do. If you integrate the task and into what is marked, integrate the technology use into what is marked, then you will ensure their engagement in a way that you wouldn't otherwise be able to ensure. Okay. So we've got a section here on using the TTT diagnosis tool, and whilst we wouldn't necessarily want everybody to use it on every module, we may get people to have people who want to use it within their courses, for example, and maybe at the beginning of a course, at the beginning of a first year of a course, we ask people to engage with the Training Through Technology tool to try and understand some of their strengths, and then action plan for improvement and act again. We would do that with our workshop participants, for example, here, but they may also want to adapt the tool for their own use. What you end up with almost inevitably with assessment or with diagnosis tools or case studies is bunch of data that needs to be analyzed to demonstrate to us whether there is an impact or not and whether there's learning gain using technology or not using technology. That will always be the case with our learning. So the first thing to do is to try and use existing data. Don't collect data twice, and set a system up that enables you to analyze that data. Make it part of what you habitually do within your module, within your course, whatever it might be, at the level that you're working at. And then try to automate it would be my recommendation. And it's certainly what we need to push forward with people. If you have learning stats that are about engagement with a learning management system, or you have learning stats that are about attendance, or whatever it is you're measuring, try and make sure that when that assessment has been made, that the feed through of that information through to students is automatic, okay, and that they get it immediately. So, for example, Valeri's done a lot of work with us to try and automate the feedback from the TTT tool, on the training through technology tool. Whatever diagnosis tools you use, you try and get automatic feedback. And there are some good tools, for example, out there about leadership that I can use, which are free, which give us instant feedback. But if I can then collect that information before and at the end of the module for a student, I can very easily then start to see some of the difference that we're making. So set up a system, make sure that as much of it as possible is automated, otherwise it's going to become extra work. Integrate it into your schedule of activities so it becomes habitual, and you might do that at course level by saying it becomes part of your approval of your assessment, or if you have approval of materials at the beginning or prior to a term starting, that it occurs then. So make sure that it becomes part of that system. Get administration support to support the processes, to make sure that you take the burden off the teachers as much as possible, where you can't automate it, and make sure that it's core to learning. So make sure that it is absolutely revisited. I'm not saying you would want to revisit it on a 10-week module every week, but it becomes integral to what you're doing, and it's at the forefront of people's minds. So thinking of Valeria's example of doing digital stories, the assessment becomes a digital story. The digital story and the technology is a vehicle for presenting results of a project or research that students have done, and that production of that digital story would be talked about not just as a side piece of assessment, but you would talk about it in session 1. You would talk about the process of developing that story as you go throughout those 10 weeks of a module, rather than just having it as a side issue. Make it central to what you're doing and part of the experience. At the end, with what time there would be spare, and again, I'd be talking about another 20 minutes of discussion or so. We'd be thinking about where you have or can source the following skills in your department. As a teacher, as somebody who's setting up learning through technology, and the sorts of skills that we need to be able to implement learning gain are assessment design skills, skills for using technology, data analysis skills, because we've got that element at the end, systems development skills to try and automate things. Now, those skills I'm suspecting will not already exist in every school, every department, every course. And so if you don't have them, you do need to think about where to get them. So where you have these skills, identify them. How are you going to get hold of them? How are you going to use them? Where you don't have access to them right now, where will you source them? And how will you develop your ability to deliver the potential that measuring of learning gain has? And this is a discussion. So I do it for my modules, for example, so I can demonstrate to you. One of my colleagues just left. You might have seen him walk behind me. For one of my modules, I can show you a good 6 years worth of data of where students have taken their learning gain measure at the beginning and the end of the module, and they have all been assessed as one of their assessments on the reflection on how they've planned to make a difference on their skills at the beginning, what they've done, and then how they've made a difference and where they need to go next. So they have a plan for what to do after the module. I've got 5 years worth of that data. I can really clearly show where we've made a difference and where we haven't. And one of the areas where we don't make a difference is on a topic called negotiating contracts. Now, funny enough, when you go back and have a look at what we do, that's because we don't really have any more than 2 slides on it within the whole course. We're not focusing enough on it. And there's other areas that we do a lot and we make a difference. And then there's other areas where people are mostly skilled, we found out when they arrive with us, and they don't really need help in improving it. So maybe we could do less on one area and do more on negotiating contracts. So certainly we see that difference and that ability to do things better through measuring learning gain. And we ought to be doing that when we're working with technology. We need to be able to demonstrate that when we introduce technology or a different way of doing things, that we are making a positive difference through it. Okay, and that's where I'm going to shut up and open up to questions.